And now to Sudan. In 1 week, citizens' protests have forced Mr. Omar al-Bashir, the country's longest-serving leader, to step down, leaving the military in control. And just like in Algeria, the people are not backing down, calling for a return to civilian rule. And that's because the military announced the next elections will take place in 2 years. They've suspended the constitution, as well as federal and state institutions, and imposed a curfew. The last three have, of course, changed in the last 2 days. The leader of the Interim Military Council, Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah Abdurrahman Burhan, on Saturday announced the restructuring of state institutions, the end of a night curfew, and the release of political prisoners. Mr. Bashir was replaced by a military council led by Mr. Ibn Auf last week. Auf had headed the military intelligence during the Darfur conflict. On Friday, he announced he was resigning and being replaced by General Burhan, who is seen as a less controversial figure. Now, in all of these, we ask, where is Mr. Omar al-Bashir? We don't know, but we know he was arrested by the military. And don't forget, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant of arrest for him back in March 2009. A court issued a second arrest warrant for him and a combined warrant listing 10 counts against him, basically war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ICC suspended its case against Mr. al-Bashir due to lack of support from the UN Security Council, forcing the ICC to ask the Council to take steps to force Sudan to extradite Mr. Bashir. And now that he is out of office, a question arises again. Will he be handed over to the ICC? And I know just the person to ask. Joining me now is former ICC prosecutor, Mr. Charles Adeogun Phillips. Thank you for joining us on the program. First of all, I have to ask, is Mr. Omar al-Bashir's ousting a real victory for the Sudanese people?
Well, I think it is. I mean, 30 years of treacherous rule certainly coming to an end has to be seen as a victory for those who champion freedom of expression and human rights and good governance on the region of Africa. So certainly it is a welcome development.
So is this really the end for the now former Sudanese president? What do you think will happen to him from here on?
Well, following a referral of the UN Security Council, Omar al-Bashir is wanted by the International Criminal Court for some of the most audacious human rights violations known to our generation. There is finally need to see him held accountable thereof. Justice, in my view, must be done, but not only must it be done, but it must be seen by all Sudanese people to be done. The question there is, should they have a domestic or international process of accountability for the crimes committed under international law? That is the question at the moment, really.
So you think there is a chance he could either be handed over to the ICC or he could be tried in courts in Sudan?
Well, I think the matter is a little bit more complicated than that, Amarachi. The unique feature of the ICC is the fact that sitting heads of state are not immune from prosecution by the court. The idea in itself was to discourage sitting heads of state from committing heinous crimes by putting in place limits to the exercise of their sovereign statehood. So, as we've pointed out, he was therefore indicted by the court. But international prosecutions determine or depend really on the cooperation of UN member states. And in that regard, the successful prosecution of a head of state remains a huge challenge for the ICC itself. The challenges in this regard can be seen with the problems with the president of Kenya in 2014, but even the refusal of the Sudanese government hitherto to allow the ICC access to its territory to conduct investigations in 2009. Another challenge, of course, was the refusal of countries like Nigeria and South Africa to actually hand over Mr. al-Bashir to the ICC, despite his presence in their territory and the existence of an international arrest warrant in that regard. So these are all the complications that make international criminal justice extremely challenging, both for the international community and the UN Security Council, as it were.
Now, I know that people say they're more interested in a civilian government, but then there have been reactions to Mr. al-Bashir leaving office eventually, being arrested and so on. I'm more interested in the AU's response, though. The AU Commission chairperson, Mr. Musa al-Faki, says, and I'm quoting here, the military takeover is not the appropriate response to the challenges facing Sudan and the aspirations of its people. This is an AU that has apparently been deaf to the people's problems in Sudan. I know the AU did send in troops at some time, but they've never called the president, or Mr. Omar al-Bashir, out on some of these atrocities that you speak about in his own country. How can they come out now to condemn a military takeover of a government that has been really harsh towards its own people?
Well, I think it's the position of the international community as a whole to condemn military coups in this day and age. I think that's their default mode, if I may put it that way. But the AU is a slightly more complex organization in terms of its views on African dictatorship, and we have had quite a few of this. Algeria recently went. We have Cameroon still lurking in the background somewhere. But going back to the larger problem, there is a conundrum of some sort in relation to Mr. al-Bashir's prosecution and the views of the African Union, in the sense that if the ICC, for example, does not prosecute Mr. al-Bashir, then it gives credit to those who think that the court is essentially a powerless tool against powerful political figures in various countries. On the other hand, if it prosecutes Mr. al-Bashir following his removal from office, which has now occurred, it will then suggest to powerful individuals that, look, they can only be prosecuted when they've vacated office.
Yeah, I do see your point there. It will be quite difficult. I mean, because this is larger than former President Omar al-Bashir. The military, as you said, could be implicated in this. But then again, you've seen in the last 2 years the military play a pivotal role in the change of governments in countries in Africa. We saw that happen in Zimbabwe about 2 years ago, in Algeria last month, and now in Sudan. What does this really say about who is in charge in African countries and the sort of democracy that's practiced on the continent?
Well, you're only as good in office as long as your chief of defense staff or your chief of army staff supports your tenure. I think that is really the implication of what we've seen in Zimbabwe, in Algeria, and recently in Sudan. You are there at the behest of those who protect you in office, and you would find that in many African countries, the military is extremely well looked after, even in countries that are so impoverished. It's basically democracy seen in a very quasi context with military support.
So is democracy still the best form of leadership in Africa?
I would think not. I think that not only in Africa, but when we look at the sort of political arrangements we have in China, we have in Russia, we have in Rwanda, they're not democracies in the Western sense. They're quasi-democracies, but they're extremely effective because those countries have done very well. If we look at our own scenario in Nigeria and we look in terms of infrastructural development, I will have you know that in the last 20-odd years, there's been no significant infrastructural development in Nigeria compared to the days of the military regime. Abuja, for example, was built in 3 years by one man when his security was threatened in Lagos. And in 3 years, we had a new federal capital, all thanks to the military. Third mainland bridge in Lagos, and the list is endless. And one wonders when we look back at the last 20 years of civilian government, and one does not make a case for a military comeback, but it's what it is, isn't it?
I know there are many who will argue with you on that, but I do appreciate your thoughts, your opinions, your observations. They're all valid, and so is everybody else's. Thank you again, Mr. Adeogun Phillips, for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you for having me.
When we come back after the break, we discuss what Britain can do within the flex extension given by the European Union. Please stay with us.